So, and I asked Lieutenant Williams, I said, have you heard any complaints about overnight parking? And she said, no, I don't hear any overnight complaint. So obviously there's a market for daytime parking, but overnight parking, there's not complaints, so this isn't a complaint-driven system. And I think that it's something that having a few nights available, one, would reduce the headache of phone calls that Lieutenant Williams does receive about people angry about getting tickets because they didn't know the system existed, they didn't know, and so having a buffer of a few, 3, 5, 10 nights or something in a 30-day period where you don't have to pay is kind of like a welcome note for those that are new to the city, where it's like, okay, then you don't automatically get hit with a ticket, and you're like, well, what was going on? And I think that that is a pretty common standard across communities in Wisconsin, where you have a couple of nights where you're allowed to park overnight, and you still register your license plate. And I think getting people into the habit of populating their license plate into the system, then everybody is clear about that habit. And after you trigger so many nights, then you start to pay for it.
I don't want our council to lose the philosophy that has developed over the past several years, that parking is not free. And we seem to be sort of going away from that. Parking is not free. And levy limits imposed by the state and decades of voters voting for tax cuts basically have put us in this position where there is not enough revenue to pay for services. And so we're having to make reactions to those long-term decisions. How do we pay for services? How do we pay for our roads? So at a larger scale, that's what we're looking at. And we have sort of as a group collectively come to a philosophy of understanding parking is not free.
And I think now that we've had this system going for about a year, we can look at maybe taking another step, and maybe that's allowing weekly permits or monthly permits. Maybe that is, looking at the price if that needs to be adjusted. But I think it's important that change happens one step at a time. And the reason why that's important is so that you do give the departments that are affected time to adjust, and so that you don't have a huge amount of unintended consequences hit you all at once. So that's why I think taking an approach more of slowly tweaking things and making smaller adjustments along the way might work out a little bit better than just kind of dumping the whole system and saying, let's go with free parking.
We wanted to try and figure out a system where constituents didn't have to, call into dispatch. We wanted to take that burden off of dispatch, let them focus on the most serious things that they're dealing with. And then there was a recognition that, their streets have value. What do we charge for those slots? And so we ended up with this somewhat complicated system, and I've heard from constituents that it is a little bit burdensome from them, particularly if they have to park on the street a number of nights, especially it's the third shift thing. It's the car mumbo jumbo moving cars around and not having enough room in the driveway. So it's kind of where we came from. Can it be better? Absolutely.
The overnight parking had been prohibited previously.
Right.
When the Stevens Point Police Department had their own dispatch, those dispatchers did handle it. And they also handled abandoned bike pickups and a service window. And then we went to a joint dispatch with the county. And part of that agreement was that those dispatchers in the comm center take all of the same duties that Stevens Point dispatchers did. Yes, it's a burden. Most of us have jobs. Those are burdens too sometimes. But it was an agreement. They didn't like doing that, and with good reason, I'm sure. It takes up time. The sheriff, who runs the communication center, he's in charge of it, had asked us to try and move those duties away. They didn't want to handle the overnight parking calls anymore, which was really only for very special circumstances. When it was in the city, there were only a couple of times a year you could do this for special circumstances, and sometimes it was denied. If you were resurfacing your driveway, things like that. Well, it became the point where if you called in, they gave it to you because it didn't really matter, or maybe it was too much work, I don't know what the reasons were. But it became just a call in to do it. And the sheriff asked us to move it. We started looking at options internally, had discussions with the council, and at some point, I don't remember, I think it was in early spring, the sheriff says, okay, we're gonna stop taking these calls on this day. That's why we needed to do something and come up with a plan. Is it perfect? No, it is not. There is lots of room for improvement, as President Johnson said, but it's something that we need to talk about. And whether it's allowing free overnight parking, we still need to take into consideration all the things we heard the first time from the police department and the streets department, and sweeping and plowing and things like that. All of those things still exist.